Welcome to Rethinking Trade with Wallach, a podcast that unpacks international trade and how it affects you without putting you to sleep.
Welcome to Rethinking Trade with Wallach. I'm Wallach, and as I promised last week, today we're really going to get the skinny on China's threatened shutdown of rare earth critical minerals and high-tech magnet exports. We have a very special guest, Rush Doshi. He's the director of the Initiative on China's Strategy at the Council on Foreign Relations and assistant professor of security studies at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He also served as the White House National Security Council China and Taiwan director under the Biden administration. Obviously, a very smart guy. His book is called The Long Game, China's Grand Strategy to Displace American Order, which summarizes really well the most interesting work, in my view, he does, which is looking into the actual documents and statements of the Chinese government to try and discern just what they have in mind as their plans and their strategy. Welcome to the podcast, Rush.
Thanks, Lori. Great to be with you.
So when I promised everyone we had the true genius about this issue, now we're going to find out what's really going on. So 2 weeks ago, China announces these new export controls on rare earth minerals and magnets. I want to just ask you to start with, why is this such a big deal and what does it mean practically?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I got to say, rare earth minerals or rare earth elements, they are really, really not that rare, but they're incredibly important for manufacturing, right? Because the ability to process them is not well held across the world. It's actually rather concentrated in just one place, and that place is China. So by and large, China controls 90%, more than 90% in some cases, of the supply of these so-called rare earth elements. But here's the critical thing. They are super important for just about every manufacturing process. Often they go into magnets that are way stronger than normal magnets. So everything from, sometimes your AirPod case that Apple might make, or you might have a name tag at a conference that uses a nice magnet, any kind of satisfying magnetic latch like that, often going to be made with rare earth elements. Also, you look at your cars, significant portions of your cars, not just the motors, but adjusting of the seats. All of that, again, rare earths, microphones, computers, cameras, and virtually all defense equipment, the entire energy transition, all of it runs on these rare earth elements. So it's unfortunate that these rare earth elements all come from one place, because that means our entire economy is dependent on inputs from that one place. And really, it is actually shocking because the actual market value of these minerals is not that high. Way, way smaller than the price of just even a handful of aircraft that the Air Force might be making any given year. And yet they are indispensable to us because without them, our manufacturing system as we know it might shut down.
So it's the processing of them that's tricky. It's the know-how, or it's scaling it up, or why don't we have this capacity if the minerals themselves are so widely available?
Well, we used to have it. Back in the 60s and 70s, the US was a dominant producer in rare earth minerals. It's pretty much forgotten today, but we actually kind of invented the process of actually refining this stuff. We were the kings. But we gradually realized that this business was dirty environmentally, which is true. It was difficult chemically because you had to process tons and tons of material time and again, just to get a little bit of these rare earth elements out of them. And we realized that, other people were willing to do it for us. And gradually over time, we saw that this industry moved offshore, and the place that concentrated it was China. And this isn't a new idea. For a long time, the Chinese were thinking about concentrating control over this particular field. They already had really easily accessible rare earth minerals in some places. They also recognized that if they were able to figure out the process knowledge, they would be very successful. And you actually see people like Deng Xiaoping, who said a long time ago, the Middle East has oil and China has rare earths. By the way, he was paraphrasing somebody who told him that. He didn't know that. But his family was super involved in the rare earth business. And in fact, one of the main rare earth magnet manufacturers, right? So these are the guys who make magnets using the rare earths. That company was sold to China in the 1990s. That's a crazy fact, particularly because that company was making the magnets for the Defense Department. At the time, there wasn't an extensive review process. So the sale went through, but there was this little clever suggestion that maybe China shouldn't shut down the operations in the US when they purchased this particular plant. And they made the promise, but about a year later, all the capital equipment, the critical computer equipment, and all the process knowledge, all of it was transferred to China, right? So again, this is a gradual story of multiple decades of US policy mistake after policy mistake, where we just trusted the free market would deliver to us this essential ingredient, and it didn't happen.
So, the part of this that I started paying attention was when I read an article about how all of the guidance systems for US missiles use these different elements, and how we had basically sold our domestic companies to Chinese and other firms, shut everything down, and we're now reliant on imports for the critical parts of our defense system. Now, I found that shocking, but you probably didn't, given that you're always snooping on this stuff. What gave the world, or should have given the world, a heads up, and how is it, despite some sense that this could happen, we're in this boat?
Yeah, it's a great point. And by the way, that's often where the discussion was. It was focused on our defense vulnerabilities, which are significant. But what I want people to take away from this conversation in part is that the vulnerabilities are way bigger than defense. Let's just take autos for a second. The auto sector also relies on rare earths. And we might remember, back in the pandemic, we ran out of our access to certain chips from Asia. And because we didn't have those chips, auto production lines shut down. And lots of people were furloughed essentially, they lost their jobs. It was a direct hit to the American economy. Autos are 5% of American GDP. And as great as that industry is, all of it relies, again, on rare earth minerals, which is crazy. And that's true for sector after sector. So it's not just our guidance system, it's like everything. Now, you asked about warning signs, and there were plenty of warning signs, right? 15 years ago, 15 years ago, there was a row between Japan and China over these islands in the East China Sea that led to China essentially choosing to limit the flow of rare earth minerals to Japan. Now, that was a significant and catalytic moment for Japan, which then raced like crazy to try to break its dependence. But even Japan, which is pretty good at industrial policy, pretty good at scaling up when it has to, could only bring its dependency down maybe from 90% to like 50 or 60%. They still have high dependency levels. And that just shows you how hard it's going to be to break this absent not just government action, but government action in common across all American allies and partners. That wasn't the only warning, though. China has been writing about the possibility of weaponizing this tool ever since. 15 years ago, it actually did it. And it began the process of consolidating the companies in China that actually make this stuff into just a handful, ultimately, basically two big state companies, which gave them more control over the flow of the minerals. Think about this. The best defense against an export control is a fragmented market. When there's lots and lots of people making stuff, it just travels across the border. Well, the Chinese knew that. They didn't want that to happen anymore. They wanted to consolidate their control, and they did. So right now, we're basically up against a system that has thought for basically 15 years how to control this input's ability to flow across borders. Then, in the Biden administration, China began to actually use this tool in small amounts in response to our actions. But they were very, very careful. They didn't do anything too crazy. And basically 3 weeks ago, they actually decided to reach for the tool itself in the most crazy and escalatory way. And that, I think, markets, probably some listeners here have not fully woken up to what just happened.
So, one factoid that made me understand how specific of a strategy and also how extreme the control is and how dangerous is something I read, but you can tell us if this is true, that people, after this consolidation by the government of the production into the most tightly controlled, centralized venues, that then as well, the Chinese government revoked the passports of people working in these facilities so that basically people couldn't leave with the information about how to do it, how to scale it up so as to maintain the monopoly. Is that true?
Not only is that true, but you see that in a lot of different sectors, right? China has a worldview, and that view is basically that the ability to manufacture something, whether at the low end or the high end, is really worth keeping. You don't want to lose that capability, right? And they see the United States having allowed its industrial capacity to erode and go to China. In some cases, often we were the ones helping this capacity move to China. We were the ones training folks in China on how to do this stuff. They see that as our mistake. They think we made a catastrophic mistake. And having extended the ladder down to them for them to climb up the ladder, they now are pulling up the ladder, not just on us, but on the whole world. So we'll come back to rare earths in a second, but right now iPhones are made, of course, predominantly in China, but India is getting into the business, and America wants those iPhones to come from more than just China because, well, it's dangerous for it to come from one place. But the Chinese don't really want India to become a manufacturing power in this sector. So those same tools you just mentioned, Lori, limiting the ability of relevant engineers to travel abroad, limiting the flow of capital equipment to places like India, exit bans essentially on Chinese citizens, that is being used against India today. And now it's being used against the world on rare earths. They do not want this capability to travel beyond China's borders. Now, that's not totally crazy in terms of the logistics because only a handful of people really are involved in this industry. They've got a lot of research and science and development on future innovation, but these were small industries by and large. So that system, which can easily thwart the flow of people, is doing that. And remember, when they announced these new export controls about 3 weeks ago, they did put the controls on the flow of the equipment used to process the rare earths. So let's rewind the clock back. In the 90s, we let them have the company. We even let them have the capital equipment and the personnel and the computer software associated. And now they won't let that same stuff flow overseas, right? So they climb the ladder and they're pulling it up after them.
And what I want to make sure everyone is fully comprehending is, again, what Rush said. These minerals are not that rare. They're rare to get processed in and then to be able to be used to make these super strong magnets, etc. But the actual material is scattered in a lot of places. So with China holding on to the technology, the know-how, etc., it basically is a worldwide problem because it's not just our production in all these areas. Literally, this move could shut down the modern economy kind of worldwide with an enormous amount of geopolitical leverage of basically sign up with us or else your industry is getting shut down. So this is the thing. This scares the bejesus out of me. Yet, why do you think there are a whole bunch of people saying, oh, this is not such a big thing. Oh, don't get worried. Oh, this is just like what the US does with some of its technology. What is that, first of all? Unpack that. And then what's that about?
Yeah, and people are making those arguments. Really prominent people who write on China are basically saying this is a reasonable response to US export controls. Let's just go through some of the arguments one by one. Here's what I want people to take away, I think. This is the most important part. You know, China has been basically throttling the supply of these minerals to us ever since the trade war really took off under President Trump. That's when they really kicked it up a notch. And in particular, they said, hey, all of the magnets that involve rare earth minerals or the ones produced in China or the flow of those minerals to the guys who make the magnets in the United States, all of that is going to start getting cut off. And so they went after the auto sector, and the auto sector was basically about to shut down, and a lot of economic activity was going to stop. And I think when President Trump realized that, he quickly sued for sort of peace with China in the trade war. Now, China was nervous about using that tool because they thought, well, the American government might respond. They might come after us with financial sanctions. They might deny the flow of chips to us across the board, not just those really small number of AI chips, but all chips. They might go after software exports to China, and that's a really big deal. A lot of stuff is made using American software. There's a lot of tools that America has, but we didn't reach for any of them. Instead, under President Trump, what we decided to do was find a kind of detente with China. Now, the Chinese watched that and they thought, we've got him, we've got his number. And they recognized that there was an advantage now ahead of these big trade talks and this big bilateral summit between President Trump and President Xi that's happening next Thursday. They figured we can push again and maybe he'll fold again. And what I hear from people is that the Ministry of Commerce built this big tool, this big licensing regime that says exactly what you said, Lori, that rare earths anywhere from China, like in any part of China that are sold abroad, no matter where they go, no matter what they're going into, there's going to have to be a license. Now, they haven't enforced that across the board, but like I said, they're already throttling the supply to the US and others. They're already doing it. So enforcement is in the eye of the beholder. Of course, they're doing a version of enforcement to get leverage, but they could go much, much further. And so now the question is, what will the US do? People say this is a lot like what the US did with chip controls. We said the best chips couldn't go to China. But that argument isn't exactly right. And let me tell you why. If we were to put a similar set of controls on chips equivalent to what China has done to us on rare earths, here's what it would look like. It would look like every chip no matter how good, no matter how bad, anywhere in the world that is made with the slightest bit of US technology requires a license to go to any other country. Basically, any chip sold anywhere requires an American license, a good chip, a bad chip, a chip that's used for AI, a chip from 1994. All of them would require a license. Now, we would never do such a thing. That would be a crazy act. Even in the Biden administration, as we considered a variety of tools on chip controls, never once did anyone propose anything remotely like that. It didn't even come up in a meeting because it's so crazy. And yet, that is exactly what China has just done to the entire world, and basically no one has reacted, right? There's not really a significant response. A little bit of market response here and there, but the world is continuing. And let me just end with this, Lori. Right now, there is a risk that certain auto companies are going to run out of this stuff in a few weeks. And already the Chinese are saying, forget the auto companies. None of your defense companies are ever going to get this stuff. No matter what you negotiate, a quote unquote defense end user is never going to access this. And so you began by saying, there are real vulnerabilities in our defense system. We rely on this for defense purposes. China is saying, that's too bad. You can't have a defense sector anymore. We're going to shut it down. This is the most brazen and outrageous use of Chinese economic coercion ever. And if the United States doesn't respond in kind, I think the Chinese are going to take this in stride. They're going to say, we figured it out. We've got your number. And today we're going to use this tool to get you to back down in trade talks. Tomorrow it'll be something that matters for your sovereignty, your integrity, your prosperity, and yes, your defense. And they'll push and push and push because they figured out they have a tool that we respond to.
So, given that, which is even more dire than I thought it was, and I thought it was pretty damn dire, why hasn't there been more of a response? I mean, do people think this is only a tactic leading up to these October 30 summit level Trump Xi negotiations? They don't understand that China has an end game here and the government of China is likely to, as you just described, expand this policy and this leverage. What just to leave our listeners with sort of the final punchline, what would be the appropriate response? And what do you understand to be the reason there hasn't been more of that response? I mean, it sounds like the rest of the world needs to get their act together on this and quickly.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I guess I'd say, first of all, the US has leverage that it can use to push back, and we shouldn't be afraid to use it. I think this is a moment for presidential leadership, and the president should come out and explain to the American people exactly what is happening and what the threat is to the American economy, and then prepare countermeasures and say, look, there might be some pain in the short term, but if we don't threaten these countermeasures, and if we're not willing to take them, then the Chinese will basically have a tool, a piece of leverage they can use against all of us. And I think we should come together and basically, find a way to respond. Not just alone, though. We should do it with allies and partners. Now, the problem is that some of our approach in the last few months has alienated some of those allies and partners who might otherwise want to come in with us on this approach. And they're not willing to stand with us against China if they think the president is about to give the Chinese a sweetheart deal at the APEC meeting in just a week and a half. So here's the thing: we have to be able to signal to the world and to the Chinese that we are serious about how problematic this is, and we have to be willing to escalate. And that might mean, for example, threatening certain financial sanctions. That might mean putting in place controls on the flow of certain chips, not just the high end, but all kinds of chips to China. Now they should require a license too. Let's call that proportionality. It might be, as the president threatened, saying any good made with US software requires a license to go to China. Every single one of those measures would be far less escalatory, far less expansive than what China has just done. And you don't have to actually do it. You've got to credibly threaten it. The problem is, I think the president is looking for a deal in the next week and a half. And if that is the focus, if our goal is to get a deal, sell more soybeans, sell a bit more gas and oil, perhaps, maybe sell some advanced chips in Boeing aircraft. If we run the traditional China playbook, we're going to find that the other side has a different playbook, not the one that they used to use in the past. We have to update our plays to match theirs. Right now, President Xi is not playing his cards, right? He knows America has strong cards, and he's not worried about that because he's playing the player, right? To use a poker metaphor, he's not playing the cards, he's playing the player. And right now, they think President Trump is more weak than he is crazy. It's in the president's best interest for President Xi to think that he's more crazy than he is weak. And by the way, that very well could be true in this case. So we're going to see. Right now, the US side and the Chinese side are going to meet for several days of negotiations, likely in Malaysia. There's already talk going on now. The question is, what happens in the big meeting between Trump and Xi? And does Xi back down? My guess is they cannot revoke this regime, having spent so much time setting it up, and it would look like they'd, back down against our pressure if they revoked it. So, maybe the best the president can get is a ceasefire. China doesn't use this stuff against us. We don't escalate for a little bit longer. And then we race like crazy, Lori, to find a way to do this with our allies and partners at home. And like you said, this stuff isn't rare. It's not easy. The process knowledge has been lost, but I'm pretty sure that America can figure it out. And I got to just end with this. The total amount, the market value of this stuff is only a few $100 million. The actual economic activity it supports is worth trillions of dollars. So we should be able to find the capital. Maybe it won't come from the capital markets on their own. Maybe it has to come from the government and some industrial policy techniques. We can't trust the market to solve this, but we have to find a solution. And I'm quite confident that if we wanted to, we could.
All right. So you heard it here. I told you guys that Rush would make this understandable and lay out what our path forward was. Thank you, Rush, so much for spending some time with us. I hope you will come back as the developments come along. We're all going to need to stay on top of this. And we promise here at Rethinking Trade that we will be on top of it and provide as much information as possible. In the interim, may I recommend that you follow Rush Doshi on Twitter. And basically, he has been systematically communicating all the updates, all the nuance that you all need to know. Thank you so much for joining us, Rush. Thank you, everyone, for listening. This is Lori Wallach signing off for Rethinking Trade with Lori Wallach.